That's the
That's
after
the
party?
after party. That's the after party. It's an 8-bit hacker style after party, and you are invited.
Oh wait, this is the avatar thing that brings us as
Right.
close as possible
Right.
to what it's like.
I confess, I don't like these things usually, and this one's pretty good. Like when you walk up to someone, the screen comes up and the voice comes up, and you can have a chat, and then you can,
I see.
right?
Seems weird, but okay.
Well, the whole world is weird now.
No, it's just you, Aaron.
I know.
Okay, and Matilda, nice to meet you. Hello.
Hi.
You've never met
Okay.
the epic Matilda?
Well, not
Well.
not like this, no.
Okay.
And Martin, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you in person, Sasha.
All right, we're about to go live here.
Okay, you all have first backgrounds. What's going on?
Yeah. You didn't get the memo?
Not in the know.
Lucas, the only one who's allowed to have a plain
Oh
screen.
yeah, no, Sasha, don't betray me on that, please.
Okay, dude, you and me. We'll stick together.
The appropriate Guinness poster, Sasha. Don't kid yourself.
So I've been updating, or I think I will be updating my backgrounds. They were all steampunk and steampunk jesters before, but now like steampunk Tron is a thing, and cyberpunk, right? Like there's some great visual backgrounds for that. So I may be changing my thing. Cyberpunk stuff might be just too cybery, but steampunk Tron is apparently a thing. You get some cool images.
Hi, everyone. It's just gonna be a couple more minutes. We're just getting a couple technical things set up here, and then we will be starting the session.
So do we? I was a little confused. Do we have a half hour or an hour?
1 hour.
We have
You
1
have
hour.
a full hour, but if you decide to do a shorter panel to have more time for Q&A, you can. So the good thing is you won't run out of time. And you have
Right.
flexibility.
Well, I bet with this group we could probably talk for 2 or 3. Totally unscripted. So
Easily.
Yeah.
Easily. Yeah, sorry about that. I somehow mixed that up. I thought we only had a half-hour session. But now everyone can just saunter through their presentations in a very relaxed and casual style.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for waiting there patiently. Welcome back. Let's go ahead and get started. I want to first turn it over to our sponsor as a thank you, our gold sponsor here, and play a quick video.
Yeah, I used to ruin the curve in high school. But now, I'm ruining hackers' evil plans. See, I'm the one in that room most are too afraid to go in, fending off cyber threats day and night, because I use secure workstages. So I'm here, working to keep our data safe, keep our emails from becoming virus portals, and making sure our clients' information doesn't get hacked to pieces and sold on the dark web. And I'm not going anywhere.
All right. With that, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Martin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Josh, and hello everyone. My name's Martin van Hoornbeek, and I'll be moderating this session today. I really only have one little item before we get started. That's that the Q&A at the end of the session will happen in Work Adventure, which is the 2D virtual social platform of the conference. And that is also the same place where you can find all of our exhibitors and lots of other fun activities. And the Q&A will happen there in Room 2. With that, I am very, very excited today to introduce the panel towards real-world cyber risk, which will talk about a probabilistic approach to risk management for vulnerabilities. And with that, I'm really eager to hand this panel over to the good hands of Erin Leverett, who is a senior scientist with Airbus, has done lots of R&D about cyber risk, insurance, and digital forensics and incident response, and who in FIRST is probably most well known for co-chairing the insurance SIG and the EPSS SIG. So with that, Aaron, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Martin. And likewise, I'm super excited to introduce to you this panel. Putting it bluntly, the work that I will present with Matilda was inspired by the two pieces of work that you'll see come after our presentation. We've also just been informed that we have a little bit more time for this panel than we expected. So we each have prepared 10 minutes of content. It might be a little bit more now, which is great, on 3 different papers that really capture quantitative cyber risk in unique and interesting ways, and I think very practical ways that incident responders can use. So without further ado, I'll get us started and introduce you to the broad topic. So the core of today's question will be, how can we reduce uncertainty about upcoming vulnerabilities and exploitation? And the goal here was really to get predictive about these different things, not just to be reactive and think about how these things will affect us once we have more information, but how much can we learn from the data in advance of an attack? So here are your panelists. I give you their Twitter accounts so that you can follow them and tweet along and get involved. I certainly follow each of these people for obvious reasons. And, you know, the keep calm and pay attention, I mean it, right? We're going to try and go through an academic paper in 10 minutes, and then another one in 10 minutes, and then another one in 10 minutes. And if I'm really honest, not all of these are just a single academic paper. Like Jay and Sasha are going to present EPSS, which they've been working on for quite a long time and lots of ongoing work. And Luca too has many more papers to his name. So pay attention. We won't waste your time. We won't fill it with a lot of this nonsense. So moving on. So we're talking about vulnerability-centric risk quantification today. There's a lot of ways we can frame cyber risk, but we want to focus on the vulnerability and its journey, right? How many vulnerabilities will come out next year? How many of those will have exploits written? And which ones will eventually be exploited in the wild? And how heavy might that exploitation be? That's all of the topics that we'll talk about today. And not any vulnerability that you can think of. I think of this as like a sort of eigen vulnerability. Let's say there's a vulnerability coming out next week. We don't know anything about it. How much could we learn by looking at other vulnerabilities? And I think that's a useful frame for this conversation today. And the point is that not all vulnerabilities or exploits are created equal. They're not equally exploited. All of the distributions that you'll see here today are pretty awesome and extreme. So if you like vulnerability nerd stuff, here we go. So let's get started. The first project that we're talking about is vulnerability forecast. Matilda and I have been working on this for about a year. There's still more work to be done. And the gist of it is, can we predict the volume of vulnerabilities that will come out in the coming year? So I'll turn it over to Matilda, who's been the best science and lab partner over the last year to get us started on this particular topic.
Thanks, Aaron. So we can start just by looking at the data. So the goal of this project was to see if we could predict the number of CVEs that might be coming out in the next month, the next 6 months, the next 12 months even, and then also dig deeper into whether we could predict particular subsets of CVEs. So on the left-hand side, you can see a graph just giving you the total number of CVEs that we've seen in the National Vulnerability Database since from 2002 to 2020. And as you can see, there's this huge jump around 2017. And it would be very useful for a lot of people if they could predict these numbers as a kind of weather vane of how many vulnerabilities to expect in the upcoming year, particularly because that's how most people make their budgets. And then on the right-hand side, we can see a graph just showing you the top 5 products from 2015 to 2021. And what you can see is that not only do these products change over time, but also the proportion of the total number of CVEs that they take up changes over time. So it is quite a kind of challenge to predict some of these, and there are certain subsets that are not going to be predictable, and we knew that from the outset. And part of this project was figuring out which types of CVEs could be predicted within a generic framework and which wouldn't be suited to that kind of approach. So I think that next slide, maybe, please. Unless you've got anything to add to that one, Aaron.
Yeah, I will roll back just for a moment, just to say, you know, our goal was uncertainty reduction, and there's a lot of things you could predict. When you hear the word predict or forecast, you might think like we were predicting that this particular organization was going to get exploited by this particular vulnerability. That's not something we can do. Maybe some others are looking at that research. We were just looking at the volume of CVEs that are coming out on a yearly basis or on a quarterly basis. There are a couple other great papers that framed that problem before. And one of the challenges was that the data from a time series forecasting perspective looked like 3 months might be the limit because of a kind of correlation effect in noise floor. So that's why we were excited when we were able to do it for a slightly longer time frame. But yeah, just reframing this as how can we use the data to see how many vulnerabilities will come out? Which one of the two models do you want to do, Matilda?
I can talk about Q theory model. So we looked at some of the metadata that is you can download from NVD and also from MITRE, who are feeding into the NVD, but the data they're producing is slightly different, and how we could combine this information together with the total volume that you see over different time periods in order to do prediction. And there were a couple of models we came up with that were inspired purely from this metadata. So the first one I'm going to talk about is a Q theory model. So every CVE has a date that the entry was created in the database, which is prior to the date that it was published. So this is a kind of leading indicator as to how many CVEs we might expect. And the problem we had then was how can we predict when they get published? And we use Little's law, which is designed to predict the size of the queue based on the arrival rate and the wait time, and modified it slightly in order to fit our needs. So instead of figuring out the size of the queue, we wanted to estimate what is the rate at which items that enter the queue are exiting the queue. So this like small equation below is showing how we modified it. So we looked at the probability that the wait time is going to be less than the time that we're trying to predict ahead. And this model was surprisingly successful at predicting long-term volumes of CVEs, particularly up to 1 year in advance. And Aaron can talk about the other model we developed.
The serial number prediction, yeah. And then just to cue you up for when I finish as well, maybe we can say a little bit more about what we use as a score for success, the prediction intervals, and how we tested some of these things. But Matilda is, of course, very professional, very clean cut, and describes her Q theory approach in a very robust way. I think of it a little bit like a wine cellar, right? You know the amount of wine bottles that are going in, you know the amount that first attendees drink, then you can probably imagine the exit rate of bottles to the recycling bin. And of course, if you have any of two of those parameters, you could estimate the other ones, right? Like if you know how many bottles are being drunk and how many bottles are arriving, you could figure out how many are in the wine cellar. Or if you know how much is in the wine cellar and how many are being drunk, then you can figure out how quickly they must be arriving. So that's the advantage of Q theory. And part of the reason that we used that approach was the first kind of breakthrough that we had was that the serial number prediction would allow us to extend past that 3-month window that I was telling you about. So you will show you in a little while some graphs of variance that'll explain why that 3-month challenge was a hurdle. But essentially, serial number prediction is it comes from history. There was a point in time where the Allies wanted to estimate the number of tanks that were being produced by the Axis in World War II, and they were capturing tanks and recording the serial numbers. And so the maths of this is really quite old, but essentially what we do is we take the CVE year and the CVE ID and decompose it as a string. Many people think that the CVE year is the date of publication, but it's the date of assignment, and you can find that documented. I think Jay was actually one of the first people to point that out to me. But if you look at a lot of CVEs, you don't necessarily see that until you look at enough of them, and then you notice that it's the year of assignment. And if you decompose that ID, then of course that's a serial number, and you can look for the max of that ID And then you just have to correct for the number of observations, the number of publications that you've seen this year. And of course, there's some small difference from this serial number prediction and the number that are actually published. Not everything that goes into the CVE pipeline gets published. So I think of this serial number prediction kind of like a lottery. So if you need a metaphor for describing this, the Q theory is the kind of wine cellar version. The serial number prediction is kind of like if there was a lottery in a small town and you didn't know the population of the town, but you knew everyone bought a ticket, then each year that someone won, you could record the number. And some years that number would be higher than others. And as you extend that over time, you would start to get closer and closer to the population of that neighboring city. So kind of lottery prediction and wine cellar prediction are the metaphors I like to use because I'm not as professional as my colleague Matilda. So maybe we should say a little bit more about how we tested these and their predictive value.
Yeah, so we obviously have got two models here. Why do we have two models? Well, partly because there are two of us and we were arguing about it, and that was the fun of doing this research. But how could we figure out who was winning the ultimate battle of predicting the total number of CVEs? We had to develop some kind of testing methodology. And a straightforward validation we could use was just imagine that we're sometime in the past, try and predict how many CVEs come out in the next year, and then compare that to the real value. And then repeatedly do this over time to see how the models performed. And we called this kind of retrocasting back in time. And then the metric we used in order to benchmark the models against each other was the prediction interval at 95% confidence. So one model might predict 1,000 CVEs coming out in the next month or 20,000 coming out in the next year. And then with a plus or minus prediction interval of 1,000 or 500. And in that case, we'd go with the model that chose the prediction interval of 500 because it had had better historic performance at getting the right value.
And so we analyzed a lot of models, not just these two, but we found that these two enhanced all of the machine learning models that we played with from that point on. All right. So using that approach, Matilda?
Yeah, so this is a little diagram on the left-hand side of the approach that I just described of a retrocasting. So we can't use the serial predictor or the queuing theory model for predicting subtypes of CVEs, because even though we know the arrival date of the CVE beforehand, we don't know which product it refers to necessarily. So we do still have to use that volumetric historic data, but we were able to use the indicators from the serial predictor and queuing theory as features into the machine learning models. So the top graph of these three stacked on the left is showing how the models were performing historically when we trained like a few hundred of them, because machine learning models have many parameters, and the best way to find the best one is just to have a go. Up for debate about that later. And then the next graph down shows when we refined out the best hyperparameter choices for each of the models against our statistic models. And then in the end, we cut down to a single model, and these orange bands here are showing the prediction interval around the historic prediction, and then how far we had to kind of predict into the future one whole year later, and then how well the true prediction was against our interval. And then the right-hand side just shows how we use this methodology to choose a different model each time, because data changes over time. The way that MITRE operates changes over time, and therefore different models are more or less appropriate at different points in time. And the black line is showing you the true number, and then the orange line is showing you what would happen if we just used last year's number, because that was the kind of straw man that we needed to beat the kind of dummy model. So as you can see, this approach was beating, just taking the previous value, and therefore we are making like some improvement on the baseline.
Essentially, like if all of your models just predict the mean of the previous 2 years, if you don't beat the mean, then you're not really using a predictor. So we set that as our like initial goal cognition, and then each time we got a model that was better, we would set that as a new goal condition. So, okay, this one has got a prediction interval that's, like 1,000, or this one's got a prediction interval that's 200 or whatever. And once we extended the window out to a year, as you can see, we predicted, or the algorithms predicted that there would be 15,663 and there were 16,160. And that's a repeatable sort of process. We were pretty happy because we think if you're trying to plan patching over the coming year, that's good enough for most risk managers to work with. They can handle an uncertainty of plus or minus 5%. And just to stress what Matilda was saying about the changing of the models, if you remember the serial number predictor and the queuing theory, one of the reasons, like when we first found the serial number prediction, that was great because that extended us beyond that kind of 3-month window. But we realized that if you predict in June, you're only predicting up until Christmas, right? So you're not really getting a year's prediction. And that's where we needed to turn to Little's Law to build another model that it could extend over the Christmas period. But I think that process is also illustrative of why we change models at different times of year and why some models perform different at different times of year. So one of the challenges, or one of the things that we really wanted to get across, previous research has really focused on that 3-month window. And why did that exist? If you do a decomposition in time series analysis and you look at detrending and first order differencing of the time series, you would see something like the red line in the graph on the top right. And basically that variance is really, really high. And it makes it difficult to predict how many vulnerabilities will come out next month. But when we looked at things on slightly larger timescales like quarters or even years, then the variance reduces. So years is green in that graph up at the top. And that means that the serial number predictor that we found, when that extended the window up to a year, it became very obvious to us that we could get a lower variance and a higher accuracy by looking at a longer time window. And I personally have never seen a problem like that in forecasting that was easier to predict, or you were more accurate in your yearly predictions than you might be in your monthly. But that's what happened here. Anything I've left out, Matilda?
No, all good.
Okay. So, you can see that we can predict a volume of products within a reasonable accuracy that patch managers might use, or other risk professionals might use for a variety of different reasons. I do want to point out, having come from an ICS and SCADA background, sometimes you want to air gap things, you want to isolate things, or you can't patch them. So it's not just useful for figuring out how big should my patch team be next year. It's also useful for questions like, if I don't patch this thing for 2 years, how many vulnerabilities might I see in that time period? But getting back to this core point, like, why can't we do all the products? Not all the products decompose in the correct way to be able to use these same approaches. As Matilda said, we can't use the serial number predictor on this because we're doing subsets of the total number. There might be some work that could be done there in the future by others if you knew the top and the bottom of the CVE IDs for a certain product. But the main reasons are that sample sizes are too small. For some vulnerabilities, we've never seen them before. There's only 5 of them. We can't do a lot of statistical analysis. Also, different patch release cadences. So when you try and match correlation for Oracle, for example, products, that's 3 months in the past because they patch on a quarterly basis instead of a monthly. So it can't be detrended, doesn't pass an augmented Dickey-Fuller test, and it might be predictable, but the uncertainty is too high. The good news is about 48 products do have potential for volume forecasting in these ways. And we'd love to work on some other things, such as, can you predict the CVSS score? Turns out that's highly dependent on the product. It's also highly dependent on type. Type is a particular challenge because it's mostly written up in natural language forms. For example, a cross-site scripting vulnerability might not be appropriate in certain programming languages or certain products. So even though it makes up, 12% or something of all CVEs, that doesn't mean it would be 12% of the given random CVE that you're thinking about. So on the right, we have one of our predictions. And Matilda, do you want to say anything more about this particular slide before I go on?
Well, no, I think I'm conscious of time and I want to hear,
Okay.
make sure we hear from the rest of the panel. And this is just our kind of forecast taken back last year against the kind of mean of the last 2 years. And yeah, please come and ask us about it later.
Yeah. I'll say a little bit more about the graph on the left, and then I'm keen to hand over to everybody else as well. But that's the accuracy graph. So you can see the graph on the left is kind of a longer time view of what on the right is a snapshot in time. On the left is kind of how did it perform. And the dotted lines are our predictions. And then the solid colored lines are the actual results. And the reason there's shorter ones down below is that's the 1 year prediction, the 6 month, the 3 month, and the 1 month. And that's why they're different lengths. But that's us. And I want to remind you that our presentation today was research that was really inspired by the next two pieces you see. So if you imagine, 1,600 vulnerabilities are coming out next year, how would you know which ones were going to get exploits? And with that, I'll hand over to Jay and Sasha.
Thanks, Aaron. Next slide. So this is EPSS, Exploit Prediction Scoring Systems. This is an effort born out of a lot of work by Jay and colleagues at Kenneth Security, which is intended to fill a gap in the industry. So we have many problems as practitioners and researchers in the information security field. One of which, a big one, is prioritizing which vulnerabilities to patch. There are existing standards and efforts and strategies that everyone knows about based on current scoring systems and certainly idiosyncratic behaviors of the firm and whatever. But what we don't know, what we haven't been able to create as a capability, is an understanding of how the threat landscape is changing and which vulnerabilities actually are being exploited in the wild. And that's what this effort is trying to do. It's a standards group now, an emerging standard under FIRST. And in addition to predicting which vulnerabilities will be exploited on a score from 0 to 1, 0 to 100%, we would also very much like the long-term goal of this is to be able to understand that threat landscape and hopefully be able to explain the threat landscape, explain why certain vulnerabilities are being exploited relatively more than other vulnerabilities. So that's our long-term goal. But there's lots of work, of course, that we need to do in order to get there. Next slide. The next bunch of slides, I think Jay will take you through the model.
Sure. So this is some research that my company did with Kenna, where we're looking at remediation timelines and the amount of remediation going on. And so each point on this plot is an organization doing vulnerability scanning and remediation over time. And this is over about a 2-year period. And what's interesting is that across the horizontal, across the x-axis, we're seeing how many open vulnerabilities are seen per month on average across this 2-year window. And then on the vertical, we're seeing how many did they close per month. And what's interesting is that that red line is about 10%. The red line is doing a best fit here. And so given all of the vulnerabilities that companies have across their network, and you can see in the upper right, gets over 10 million. And those, about 10% of those are being remediated every month. And so the question is, which 10%? And that's the huge challenge I think that organizations face. How do they decide what to fix and what needs to be delayed, because they're not getting 100% closure rate every month. They're not even close. They're about 5 to 20% in there. Next slide, please. And so the main thing that we want to grab to try and solve this prioritization challenge is data, trying to get at the data to understand what's going on, what are the attributes of these vulnerabilities, and how do they help us try to understand which are being attacked and which aren't. And by the way, that's what we're focusing. We're focusing on exploitation activity. And if you're trying to make a full decision, typically based around risk or perhaps time, commitment, cost, that sort of thing, we're looking at a small part of that sort of traditional risk equation. We're only looking at the threat here. And so as you're trying to make a decision, you want to take the thing we're doing here to EPSS along with a whole bunch of other things in your environment, the data, the asset, all this stuff. But this is looking at our data architecture. So a lot of the things that we're focusing on right now is sort of to the top of this, where we're looking at getting data to correlate and enrich, bring all that data together. And of course, the best way to do that is with a CVE ID. So with all of these disparate vendors and all these data sources, everybody hopefully is tracking the CVE and we can start to bring in things like exploitation activity or exploit creation, publishing of exploit code, trying to bring that in and correlate it and bring it all into essentially talking about the same vulnerability. Then from all of that data, we're going to do feature extraction. We're going to try and extract what variables are going to be helpful. Is that the CWE information, the CP information? How do we bring out that information to make it accessible to a model and hopefully make it meaningful? And then we're going to do some tweaking of that and some tuning of the model and model generation. We went through this for the first EPSS, and we're in the process of going through it for the next version, which hopefully is going to be a lot better, faster, stronger, all that good stuff. And those data sources are on the right, sort of the typical sort of sets of data sources. The interesting thing is on the exploit activity side, we're working with Fortinet and we're working with Alien Vault, Proofpoint, several other companies, especially through Kenna Security, to try and understand what is going on in that attacker sphere. What are the threat capabilities? What are they going after? What is the activity around exploitation in the wild? Which I think is really what's going to set this apart. Next slide, please. And when we did the first one, we had a couple of requirements that we're dropping for the second one. One of them is that it had to be very easy to implement. When we were designing the first one, we thought people are going to want to do this in Excel. We had no notion of a centralized system. For EPSS version 2, we're going to a centralized system with API so that nobody has to go out and gather data or rate things or fill in questions or anything. They're just going to get a score from a centralized API and or just downloading all the scores. So the first model, though, we tried to limit the number of variables to things that were objective, easy to grab, all this good stuff. And we came up with these 16 variables. And the model is on the left. You can see the weights that were derived from the data. And then sort of a visual representation of those weights with the dashed line and the vertical there talking about things on the right are contributing to the probability of exploitation. Things on the left are going to detract from that. And then the width of those distributions are sort of talking about the confidence around that score. And when we take a score, we're just grabbing the central point of those curves. And then we're putting in that formula and getting out the probability of exploitation within the first 12 months. And that's what we trained this to. And that's another thing we hope to shift with V2 about what we're actually trying to predict. Next slide, please. These are two curves. If you haven't seen these before, they're a little complex, but if you've seen them before, they're really helpful. As you've seen a lot of these, they become a little bit more intuitive. But the one on the left is a rock curve, and we're trying to push the line into the upper left. And one of the things that we wanted to make sure EPSS was doing is that it was better than what people are doing now. And so we compared it to CVSS. And so that left one, we're trying to push that line into the upper left. If that line went straight up and straight over, it would be a perfect model. It is not. And so we've got room to expand and to get better. But you can see the CVSS line, and this is a continuous line because we're outputting between 0 and 1, or as Sasha said, 0 and 100%. So if you start at 100% and go down, you're going to start in that lower left corner and go to the upper right corner. Depending on where you are, you're going to change your false positive rate. So if you fix everything above 60% and above, you're going to be, with a low false positive rate and sort of a low true positive rate. But as you go up, you're going to increase your false positive rate and your true positive rate. And same thing with CVSS score. As you lower your threshold for remediating, you're going to go higher in the false positive rate and higher in the true positive rate. And so you can see in the left one, we're exceeding what CVSS is capable of predicting as far as exploitation activity. The one on the right, precision recall curve, we relabel these in a lot of the papers we've done about efficiency and coverage. The vertical is about how efficient the things that you remediate, how efficient is that? And when you start on a high score, you're starting on the left side of that. And this one we're trying to push to the upper right. So you can see we've got a lot of room on this particular set of metrics to go and improve. But as you start on a high score, you're going to have a very high efficiency and a low amount of coverage. And coverage is, out of everything that you should be remediating, what % are you actually remediating with your decision approach here? And so you can see CVSS is quite low on this one, not very efficient. And that's something we talk about in a lot of our research about comparing the efficiency. And really what you're going to get from EPSS is that you probably will have to attack and go after less, remediate less, and be more efficient in your approach. And so as we look at V2, we're going to be pushing the left one to the upper left and the right plot to the upper right. Next slide, please. To try and evaluate performance, the slide we just looked at was one way to look at the performance. This is another way. We're talking about the predicted probability, and so the plot on the left is a calibration plot. And essentially, when people say, hey, you predicted this one to be 20% and it was exploited, so you were totally wrong. And that is not at all what probability is all about. It's when we say 20% of everything we say is 20% is probably going to be exploited. And that's the way that probability works. And so this plot is saying, hey, when we're talking, 60%, we expect 60% of those to be exploited, and so on and so forth. So when you see something rated at 1%, and there are a lot of things rated less than 1% here because it's very heavy-tailed, what we see is about 1% of those rated 1% are probably going to be exploited. That this calibration curve is pretty closely following what we would expect, that dashed line on the left. The one on the right is just a quick sort of density plot looking at the distribution of vulnerabilities that are rated high or low and where they actually observe to be exploited or not exploited. And you can see that red density is definitely more to the right. The not exploited is definitely more to the left. And there are some that overlap. There are some that are rated very low that are exploited, and there are some that are rated very high that are not exploited. And this is not a perfect model, but we're trying to improve. We're trying to do better than what is out there currently. And that's really the key here. We're just trying to make things better. And hopefully with V2, we're going to make it even better. And V3, again, keep on improving. And so a lot of that is going to be driven by the data we have available and all the work that we're putting into constructing these models and tuning them and making them performant. Next slide, please. And I think here I'll turn it over to Sasha to talk about the relationship between EPSS and CVSS.
So this is the last slide that we have, but let me take a couple minutes before Luca's great work. So this is either a very powerful slide or a highly contentious one, depending on your views and biases. What this represents is an illustration of, as Jay mentioned, the relationship between CVSS and EPSS. And if you believe that CVSS is a measure of severity of vulnerability, it's a composite of a bunch of different things. But in addition, a measure of severity, and EPSS is a measure of probability, of likelihood that vulnerability exploited. What you have is this kind of familiar sort of risk curve now, or this risk graph, this risk matrix. Now, it's not, entirely exhaustive of all risk issues, certainly, but it does capture these two. And what enables you to do, what these two standards will enable you to do, is to plot each of the vulnerabilities and groups of vulnerabilities on a figure like this. And what you see, first of all, is a lot of the mass centered on the bottom of the figure, suggesting that it's not only true, that it's not exclusively true that attackers are going after high severity vulnerabilities, that they're exploiting high severity vulnerabilities. Moreover, most vulnerabilities are not being exploited, right? I think this has come to be known to be true through different research efforts. 5%, give or take, of all vulnerabilities are being exploited. So what you see on the bottom axis, on the x-axis, CVSS scores from 0 to 10, EPSS from 0 to 1 or 100%. So the stuff in the top right, we would argue, represents those vulnerabilities that could lead to a full compromise of a system being exploited from anywhere in the internet and have a high probability of being exploited. The stuff in the bottom left, not so much. And you can figure out there may be different strategies for an organization to interpret and respond and remediate these different vulnerabilities. But what I would argue is that this is a very powerful figure because it provides a very nice illustration of potential strategies for enterprises in addressing these different vulnerabilities. Something that I would add has never been possible before because we didn't really have a good understanding of the exploitability of any of these vulnerabilities. So you could do this on a on an organizational level. You could do it on a wider enterprise level across offices, or even on a national level or international level, right? You filter out those vulnerabilities that you don't care about. There's a lot more to digest here, and happy to take questions on it. But I'll stop there. The final effort, or the final point I'll make about EPSS, again, it's an open standard. Anyone is welcome to participate. We have bi-weekly meetings, and the data, the actual exploit data, are now available and posted for anyone to go download on the FIRST site. So I'll leave that.
And I just also want to add on, if you notice in the lower right, there's a URL there at first.org. This plot and several others are being generated, I'll say mostly on a daily basis. And so like this particular plot, we have it sort of picking out 10 random CVEs and showing where they are on here. And so it changes daily as you look at it. But we've got other plots looking at, recent CVEs that are published and the scores that they have, and things that change over time, because sometimes the CPE data gets updated a week after it's published or something like that. And so the real-time stats are there, and as Sasha mentioned, the data are out there too, that you can go and download on a daily basis. And I should point out that we're in the make it work stage, and so we're in that first stage of trying to make things work. So like if you go there right now, I think last updated was Sunday, and so after we get off here, I'm going to go run it again for today. But we're still working on the back-end process of all the data, so there might be a delay sometimes in a day or two. But most of it should be current on a daily basis, and so we're going to move into the next stage of making it work well in the next stage. So, thank you.
All right, we'll take it over to Luca. So you've got a sense of how many vulnerabilities might be coming next year. You've got a sense of how likely are those vulnerabilities to have an exploit written for them. And Luca had done this great work and continues to do great work on how often will it be exploited. So Luca, take it away.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, and hello, everybody. So this part of the work, we call it the details of vulnerability exploitation, in the sense that it reflects the fact that it is now empirically very well known that frequency of exploitation is not uniformly distributed among vulnerabilities. And this part of the work that I'm going to talk you through in the next 10 minutes is going to sort of try to dig up a little bit of the reasons why and what other factors, apart from the pure, as we've seen so far with vulnerability prediction models and with EPSS. So apart from the vulnerability data that these models can use to tell you whether an exploit is likely or not, what other factors are at play. For us, it really all started some time ago now. This is a picture from 2014. For each of these slides, I will have the paper where all the sort of mathematics and nitty-gritty technical details of all the models and stuff are reported much more rigorously than what I want to bother you with today. So I will try to give you the gist. And this picture kind of does the job decently. I actually find myself to go back to this picture quite often. It started all from a very simple question, and that is, what instruments do we as the defenders have to decide whether when a new vulnerability is out, we should be worried or not, or at least not quite yet, yeah? And so we thought, well, let's see what happens if we make like a Venn diagram, right, of the universe of vulnerabilities, that is the all vuls square that you see there, vulnerabilities with a proof of concept exploit in the top left of the diagram, vulnerabilities that have recorded exploit in the wild, so that somebody said, well, at least one exploit of this thing has been detected at scale on the internet, and the exploits that are traded in underground markets, and here in particular in some of the more prominent underground markets operating in the Russian space. And well, if one looks at this, and here, of course, areas are proportional to number of vulnerabilities, two insights come up, and they're very, very much in line, of course, with what Sasha was just saying before with the last picture, but also with the rest of the sense of this panel. And that is that the answer to the first question, that is there a new vulnerability? Should I worry? Well, the answer is most likely not. And the second question one may ask is, well, yeah, but it has a very high CVSS score. Should I be worried now? And the answer is still, well, not really, not necessarily, right? And this now is part of the common understanding of what are the limits of vulnerability matrix we currently have. And indeed, CVSS has never made the promise of being a risk matrix. Not since when, at least, this course is developed enough. Yet, of course, it's still the standard de facto. But here, if you look at it very simply, and then again, the more rigorous analysis is in the paper. But if you were to just patch all the red vulnerabilities here, you're going to end up doing a whole lot of work that you shouldn't be doing, patching vulnerabilities that don't have an exploit. And you will also miss a whole lot of vulnerabilities that do have an exploit, right? So that wouldn't work wonders for you. But then again, this is very preliminary and is only looking at presence of exploit or no presence of exploit in terms of evidence. Yeah, it doesn't really tell you how frequently a certain exploit would be used, or whether that distribution is somewhat uniform across exploits. So next slide, please. And so this is where the sort of the heavy tails of exploitation come into place, because if you zoom in into only the exploited vulnerabilities, so this is not all CVEs, these are CVEs for which an exploit has been reported in the wild, and you look at the distribution of the frequency of attacks against these different CVEs, and here I present a view split over different software types, and you see that there is a hugely skewed distribution there, whereby a very, very small fraction of vulnerabilities carry a disproportionate amount of risk with respect to all the other vulnerabilities, even though those other vulnerabilities do have an exploit. So the numbers are staggering, right? I mean, if you look in the worst case, you could have up to 5% of the vulnerabilities for which an exploit in the wild exists, carrying up to 95% of the attacks. And this is roughly true for Windows, for productivity software, that is Office platforms and so on. Browser software, it speaks for itself. For plugin, it's a slightly different story, but once you actually dig into the data, you see that if you differentiate all the reason why the curve is moved more toward the equality line there is really because that trend is driven by Java. And the whole difference stays in the pre-Oracle and post-Oracle, let's say, division of Java. So when Java was still Sun Microsystem, up until 2009, this rule was not true. Once there is the switch over to Oracle Java, this becomes true. Well, the reason probably lays in the fact that people that were deploying the Sans version of Java were delaying moving over to the Oracle version. And this created this effect whereby certain vulnerabilities remained around for much longer and created this effect. But the bottom line of this is that clearly there is a strong skew with respect to what attackers are actually doing with vulnerabilities, that simply looking at CVEs, and that as we saw before, also by simply looking at success scores, is not going to tell you. And what is also a bit impressive, perhaps, from this is that, so this comes from data that comes from millions of hosts worldwide, right? And it spans several years of observation. So what you would expect there is that there is some kind of oscillation. Maybe some vulnerabilities go up and then they're replaced by another one. Even if they carry the vast majority of attacks, you wouldn't expect such a small fraction to remain responsible for the vast majority of attacks for such a long period of time. This tells us something, right? Because if attackers were actually reacting so quickly at the introduction of a new vulnerability and immediately exploit them at scale, then this plot here, these data would make no sense. So obviously that explanation doesn't match reality, and we need to find a better one. So next slide, please. So this is what follow-up work tried to do in that direction. It's really trying to ask how often does the threat scenario change when you look at vulnerability exploitation? And again, the paper is in the footnote there, and you will find lots of very detailed models that explain the data both from a more foundational but also more empirical way. But this graph again sort of sums up the intuition behind it. And what you see here is how much time on the x-axis it has to pass for a new attack against a certain type of software is more likely to arrive again on one of your systems than an attack that you have already seen in the past. So essentially it tells you for how long the attackers are gonna keep using and using and using again the same vulnerability, attacking the same kind of software before they have to switch over to a new vulnerability that will replace the previous one. And if you look at the timeline there, we're talking of almost 3 years. So it takes 3 years for attackers to change their attack portfolio to a degree enough for a switch in the likelihood of you getting a new exploit as opposed to an older one against the software platform that you still have deployed. And the time that passes in there is almost 800 days. So this clearly is completely incompatible with the idea that every new CVE that is out there must be patched immediately, because at least when you look at attack at mass, obviously attackers are not behaving like that. And having a defensive model that is completely disassociated from that simply makes no sense, if nothing else, because that model generates data that is as extreme as the one that we've been showing you today and throughout the whole presentation, really, including the work from Sasha, Jay, and Matilda and Arian. So the question is, what is it that we can do to try to figure out what is it that these attackers are trying to do, at least when we look at attacks at mass? That is where the next slide comes in handy. And so what we've been doing and is really trying to figure out and to sort of reverse engineer a little bit the attack economics that are behind exploit innovation and threat innovation by attackers themselves, and see whether these intuitions on top of the vulnerability data that we already are aware of, including CVSS and severity scores and whatnot, can add more information to how we actually go about predicting whether a vulnerability will be exploited and possibly also to what extent. And so we've been doing this by looking, and this is something that we here at UE are now, me and my group have delved into quite a bit, and in the direction particularly of finding out what are the reference communities and what is the kind of threat intelligence that you want to look at, or at least the sources of the threat intelligence you want to look at, to have credible information about whether a vulnerability carries significant risk or represents that noise that we have characterized for the past 40 minutes now. And here are two examples of these data sources, one on the left-hand side, one very common, very famous underground market where they sell everything from drugs to vulnerability exploits and malware. But there you find some kind of threat that is not really technologically interesting, in the sense that it doesn't really tell you much about the actual innovation that attackers put in place. So to give you an example, there you would be buying for $6 on the left-hand side of this slide. For $6, you would be buying a PDF manual of how to deploy the Zeus botnet. That is also, and the bot and the Zeus malware is available on GitHub for you to download freely. On the right-hand side is a more prominent Russian underground market where they actually sell some of the more prominent attacks that we've been looking at. And once you start diving into that data, next slide, please. Once you start diving into that data, yes, and you look at the numbers, again, all the paper evolves in depth into the different statistics. And here I only present you the threat innovation, the ones that are relevant to threat innovation. And if you look on the left-hand side, I give you a count of how many new vulnerability exploits come up into these markets per year. And you see that the pace at which they arrive is not very, very high. But on the right-hand side, I provide you with some breakdown by software vendor of the time that passes in between the market starts demanding a new vulnerability exploit that will substitute the ones that is already being traded into that market, or the ones that are already being traded into that market. And if you just look at the scale of the x-axis of the right-hand side plot, next slide, please. And you look at that and you compare it, no, the previous one, the one with the animation, sorry, but yeah, that was the trick. If you look at simply at the time scale there, you see that there is a staggering match between what attacker economics can tell us about threat innovation and what you can actually go about measuring in the wild. So now, next slide. And with this, I will conclude. So the idea is really that we can factor these things together. I think that with what we've been presenting so far, you may be convinced that vulnerability data is already extremely important to make to move toward more quantitative assessments of risk. But once we're actually able of figuring out more about the attacker behavior, particularly in relation to attacks at scale, then we can actually build quantitative measurements of vulnerability exploitation. On the left-hand side there, you see relations, and if you click the button area, an image will appear that is perhaps more meaningful than just the table per se. But what this simply tells you is that there is a very clear relationship between attacker economics and the behavior of mass attackers with respect to our ability to predict whether a vulnerability is going to be exploited in the wild. And if we start plugging this into an actual quantitative framework, and this is the plot on the right-hand side that comes from another study, and we start looking at insights from these considerations and plugging them into our risk functions, then we can actually derive quantitative risk assessment methods that are moving finally away from simply having experts that tell you, yeah, I think this vulnerability is going to be very bad, you should patch it immediately, to actually evidence-based risk matrix that can tell you on a vulnerability by vulnerability basis, and as a function of time and of your system, what the actual risk realistically could be. Again, in the framework of mass attackers or attacks against the mass of internet users. With this, I will wrap up. I don't know how we did with time, but I think, Arian, we're happy that we had that extra half an hour.
Absolutely, yes. And thank you again, all of you, for joining me in this presentation. To the audience, if you're anything like me, your head is probably swimming with this. I hope that the number one takeaway from all of this great research is that the attackers can be predicted to some degree. And so there is hope. You know, there's this overwhelming story in our industry that defenders just have to react, and they can't predict, they can't forecast, they're always on the run and they're exhausted. But I think we've just shown you 3 excellent stories of hope about how in the future you might be able to do less work and better defense all at the same time. So with that, we will be taking questions inside the Work Adventure app. I hope you'll join us in 2-bit space to give us questions. And thank you very much for listening to this presentation. I know that you're all busy people, so I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to these fantastic researchers. So yeah, see you in the questions.
Thank you very much, Aaron, and thank you so much, all of you, for indeed 3 very inspirational stories on how we can do security better. Everyone, the Q&A will happen in Work Adventure. You just walk up to the 2nd floor, there's a room 2 there, and you can ask questions to these esteemed panelists there, and also join us afterwards for the open social hour also in Work Adventure. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you to the presenters.
Thank you.
So